Let's get ready to rumble! It's Rob B here with Rob D, and this week we are battling, and of course, we'll be talking about the election as well.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us for this showdown. And we're going to be taking 7 eternal property debates, the most contentious ones we can find, and attempting to put them to bed once and for all. It's going to get messy. It could get a bit bloody. Make sure you stick around.
The day this podcast goes out, it's election day. If you're listening to this a few days later, well, hello to you in the future. You know the result from the election. But let's face it, even us on election day have got a pretty good idea of what the future holds, and at least who our next leader will be, who will be the main party. I guess it comes down to by how much. That's really the result. And who else was involved in the mix? Because with a reasonable degree of certainty, I feel I can say that Labour are going to win this election. This could turn out to be the biggest shock ever and be wrong, but it looks like we're going to have a Labour government. So this week's news story, we're looking at sentiment, and the sentiment is influenced by the election as well. Rob, let's start off with sharing some of the data and how landlords are feeling about the sector right now.
Well, not that great, according to this survey from the lender Landbay. Only a third of landlords surveyed actually feel positive about their portfolios and the whole business of buy-to-let at the moment. But there is some good news in there. Last year, 37% felt negative, actively negative. Now that's down to 27%. And if you want to reach a place of happiness with your portfolio, just grow it, seems to be the answer, because those with more than 10 felt more positive than those with fewer than 10. And the most positive of all were those with more than 20. So there you go, Rob. There's your answer.
Well, I think it shows my positive nature by the fact that I took the spin on this story, Rob, as generally it's okay. You said not good, but there are more positive landlords than negative landlords. You could actually say people are overall pretty neutral because the positive is nearly wiped out by the negative, and 40% of landlords felt neutral. So overall, I think people are feeling, it's all right. It's all right. And that's okay. All right is okay. And when the negative people were asked about why they felt negative, it was the potential uncertainty to the sector that a Labour government may bring. And I found that really interesting because those people really believe that the government is going to make them a success or not. Something I've harped on about a few times now on the podcast. But today on election day, if you really think that you're going to be successful because of who comes into party, I love your positivity, but that's not going to be the case. You're going to be really disappointed. But also, if you feel that now your hopes and dreams are ruined because of whoever's come in to lead the government, well, again, I feel very, very sorry for you. You probably will fail because you have those type of beliefs, and I'd rather you be more positive. But actually, this is all down to you. The election is a lot of noise. But is the property market going to fundamentally change because of a Labour government? No, not at all. It will be changed, I'm sure. But there's been changes non-stop, it seems, over the last 10 years, whether it's global or domestic. There's just so much going on in the world. And you can always use reasons to say, okay, well, that's why this hasn't worked out for me. You're lying to yourself. Brutal, but true. You are the captain of your own ship. You are the person who will decide whether you are successful or not. And if you are successful, congratulations. I'm sure you took advantage of your luck, because you will have some along the way, but you were there to take advantage of it. And if you are not successful, you might have been unlucky, but they become lessons, and the lessons becomes wisdom, and then you become a better investor anyway. So my message to you, dear listener, and you are a dear listener because you listen to this podcast, so you do mean something important to us, is this election will not stop you. You are the captain of your ship. You're in charge of your success. Don't let this election be a distraction, and good luck.
So it is election day. Politicians are going to battle. But we're having a competitive summer. It's the Olympics. It's the football. I'm in a competitive mood, Rob. So I thought today we could have a battle between the two of us as well. And the stakes are not small. At stake are all the major issues that you see property investors debating. These have been argued about at property events and on forums for as long as I've been involved in property and way, way before. But we are going to settle all of them in the next 15 minutes or so.
Rob, I'm competitive. You know that. Our team knows that. Now our audience knows that. When we did bowling recently and I was terrible, I think I sulked for about 4 weeks.
It's actually the first time you talked to me since that day. It's only because you have to contractually.
Exactly. So let's hope this goes well for me anyway. For the sake of the podcast, we'll see. I need to win this. So I'm going strong. Let's do flats versus houses. I'm not going to be a gentleman. I'm going flats. And flats wins easily for buy-to-let because it's less maintenance, the service charges look after everything for you. The capital growth over the long term performs as well as houses. Sometimes it's a bit better, sometimes it's a bit worse, but over the long term, it's absolutely fine. I've got more flats in my portfolio than houses. You have as well. So that is it. Done, dusted, win. Thank you. 1-0. Let's go.
Don't be daft. Have you seen the number of questions that we get about leasehold for our Sunday Times column and for Ask Rob and Rob? All these issues about service charges and leases. You don't have to worry about any of that with houses. If you're spending that much money on an asset, you want to blimmin' own it. You don't want to be just leasing it for some period of time. You want to own the asset. You want to have complete control. That is the beauty of houses. And as if that weren't enough, because you tend to get more families staying in houses, you get longer tenancies, and you just don't get the hassle. I bought a house 4 years ago. We talked about it on this podcast. A lovely family moved in. They've been in there ever since. I've had to do nothing whatsoever. You're just not as likely to get that with flats. That's why houses are clearly the winner.
You know you've been lucky. You know there is more maintenance with houses. And yes, there have been issues with leases, but all the changes that have happened with leases have made it far more attractive now. They're long leases, there's no ground rents, all that stuff has gone away. And as I've said, Rob, you have more flats than houses in your portfolio like I do. So for that alone, surely that gives me the win on flats because you can sort the issues out. Most of them are old issues. The reform around leases is getting better and better all the time. There's been a lot of improvements already. And we own more flats. So therefore, give me the win.
I'm feeling on the ropes. I'm going to have to take this to a question of fact. And you said this yourself. We both have houses and flats. If it was a win either way, we'd have one or the other, wouldn't we? Maybe you'd have bought some houses in the early days, but then you would have sold them. But you haven't, have you? You've still got those houses. Purely on the facts. This has to be a draw.
All right. Let's start with a draw. But I'm not going to take that on the next one. I'm going for the win. And I'm feeling pretty confident because it's interest only versus capital repayment. Yes, on your mortgage, you can pay just the interest or you can pay down the capital. And interest only, I know, I don't even feel I need to pitch it, but I will for the benefit of the podcast. It's the way to go with buy-to-let. Nearly every property investor uses interest only mortgages. Interest only is far more efficient because you keep more of your hard-earned pounds in your pocket rather than paying down the capital. Those pounds can then be reinvested. It makes so much more sense. It is the way forward. It's the standard. That's what everyone does. Rob, I don't know how you can even argue against it. Interest only for the win.
God, you know how like barristers have got to defend the murderer even if they knew they did it. I feel like that's my position right now. Okay, capital repayment. Well, the beauty of capital repayment is that you end up owning the asset free and clear. And who doesn't want that? Who wants debt hanging over your head in your later days? Even if your cash flow is lower over the years because you're paying off that capital, you get to see the balance coming down and down and down until eventually you own the property outright. And isn't that what we ultimately all want? We want to have a portfolio of assets that we own, that we can pass down without any concerns about mortgages or whatever. And the only way to be certain of having that is with capital repayment. Was that in any way convincing? I wasn't convinced at all while I was saying that.
It would be, Rob, if it wasn't for our good old friend inflation. And we both know that inflation is going to erode the value of that interest-only debt over the long term, and quite dramatically so, to a point that that is effectively paying it down for you. With inflation, interest-only wins by a slam dunk. You know it. You've barely been able to defend capital repayments as it is, but being able to have more cash in your pocket each and every month, by able to reinvest that in more effective ways, by having inflation on your side, eroding down the debt of interest only in real terms, makes it the clear winner. Come on, do me the 1-0. It's 1-0, isn't it?
I'm actually going to tap it into my own net just to make really sure, because the absolute killer point of interest only is it doesn't mean you can't pay off capital if you want to at some point. You can overpay, you can pay off chunks. It just gives you the flexibility. So there you go, comprehensively into the back of my own net. I was never going to get there with that one.
All right, well, you might have more chance on this one because it's new build versus old properties, and which one are you going to pick?
Okay, well, if I get to pick, I'm going to pick new. And when I say new, I don't necessarily mean off-plan, and I don't necessarily mean brand new. I do mean those things, but I don't mean just those things. I mean new as in modern. Ideally, less than 10 years old, because then you've still got the new build warranty, but definitely modern. And when people disagree with this, I think they're just using their emotions. Because yes, older properties do look lovely, but my goodness, the maintenance. I own a couple of older properties, and it never stops. There's always something going wrong with damp or the pipework or the roof or something. And it's because they're older. Whereas with my newer properties, nothing happens ever, which means I'm spending less money, and critically, I'm also spending less time. And I think there are myths around newer properties that need to be busted as well. People complain about the quality of newer properties, but I've moved around a lot. I've lived in lots of different properties of lots of different types. And for newer properties, the sound insulation is way better. The actual thermal insulation is way better. The heating and cooling's better. Windows are better because materials have improved significantly over the decades. So for all those reasons and plenty more, it's got to be new, Rob.
Okay, so there's a lot of good points there. And I think if I just went for old generally, I'm going to struggle in this debate. So I'm going to use my trump card and go, well, let's go really old. And let's go for Victorian and Georgian type properties, because they are one of a kind. You can't build new Victorian properties. You can't build Georgian properties. They are unique. They have character. They are desirable. People want to live in them. People want to rent them. People want to buy them when you sell them. They are in high demand. And yes, okay, I may have more maintenance costs, but I possibly have good capital growth upside because Georgian and Victorian properties are wanted. They are beautifully built. They are spacious normally, and they are desirable. They're gorgeous. Who wouldn't want one? Is that enough?
Partially. I think you said it. Like, who wouldn't want one? Maybe you have one trophy asset, maybe a couple in a portfolio, but would you want a whole portfolio like that? Be honest, you wouldn't, would you?
No, and where I'm struggling here, Rob, is that in my portfolio, most of my stuff is newish. Other than my own home, everything is newish or new. So I am struggling, and I know what the maintenance costs on my own property that I live in. So it is going to be a win for you on that one. I don't think it's clear cut, like there are no upsides for old properties. There clearly are some, but I think overall as a buy to let investor, new build wins. Let's go 1-1. Let's now try and get a winner. Let's try and get somebody to get ahead. And we're going to do capital growth versus yield. And I'm going to pick this time because you picked last time. So I'm going to go for capital growth. It's the long-term play. It's the real wealth generator. I've said this on a podcast many times before, so I'm going in strong straight away. But nobody gets rich through yield or rent. But lots of people will get rich through capital growth with property, or well off at least, depends on the size of your portfolio. But if you buy and grow a portfolio to a reasonable size and then let capital growth do its thing, take advantage of an interest-only mortgage, inflation kicks in, you will be wealthier than the person who just focused on yield for the same period of time and went for properties that didn't necessarily give you the capital growth but gave you a yield. It might be a short-term win for the yield play, but the capital growth will win long-term. And that's what it's all about, winning over the long term.
Well, I can't deny that over the long term, majority of the wealth comes from capital growth, but you can't control capital growth. You're either going to get it or you're not. Whereas with the yield, with the rental income, you know pretty much what it's going to be. That is reliable, it's steady, it puts money in your pocket, and it's what keeps you going for the long term. And it's what generates the cash for you to expand your portfolio and expose you to more capital growth in the future. So it's not an either or, you're going to get both. But the focus surely has to be on yield because that's the thing that you can control. And if you chase capital growth, then you can get yourself into some really nasty situations. Look at all the people who were buying in London at some of the peaks because London always goes up because the capital growth is always great. They were getting no yield from their properties. They were having to subsidize and have to put their own money in because they believed in the capital growth. And then the capital growth wasn't there. If they'd invested in something on the basis of the yield, then they'd be fine. They could keep on collecting that money and eventually the capital growth will come anyway. So surely you've got to focus on what you can control.
I think the truth as we know it, Rob, is both, but with maybe a leaning to capital growth. But I think in the interests of our relationship, I might accept the draw because you can go for capital growth and have a property that yields. So go to places like Manchester or Leeds and other places that we've mentioned. Use the property podcast to your advantage. And if capital growth suits you and your strategy, because you're playing for the long term, then capital growth would win. However, I do acknowledge If you're in this for the short term, or you just need income now, and you're not bothered about long-term growth, then yield would be a win for some people. So I'm willing to shake on a draw if you are.
I think we have to call it a draw because in reality, I think the dangers come from going too far in one direction or the other. So I gave the example, if you were going for purely capital growth and had no income. There's the other end of the spectrum, if you're going for purely income, but it's the type of property that's never going to get any capital growth. Neither of those are good places to be. You want to be somewhere in the middle. Therefore, I think we have to call it a draw.
Okay, Rob, we are still 1-1 because we've had a couple of draws now. Let's try and get somebody into the lead. Hands on versus hands off. What are you picking?
Oh, well, I'm very glad I got to pick on this one because I'm picking hands off and I'm doing this with supreme confidence because I have done both of these. I've been super duper ultra hands on. I've done everything myself and I'm now super duper ultra hands off. I spend less than an hour per month on my portfolio and it's not even close. Hands off is so much better. And it's not just for the obvious reason that if you've got a choice of doing something or not doing something, it's not, I'll not do it, thanks. But what I've only come to appreciate more recently is the emotional benefit of that. If you're being hands-on, you're spending all your time dealing with problems. You're not dealing with people phoning you up all the time telling you how great everything is. You only hear about things that are going wrong and it grinds you down. It's going to put you off expanding your portfolio and really seeing those long-term benefits we've talked about. When you're hands-off, it's not like the issues don't exist, but because you're not emotionally wrapped up in solving them, it's so much easier to just go, oh, yeah, it's just a thing. Don't worry about it. Yeah, fine. That happened. I'll pay for it. Not a problem. And keep that big picture perspective. Keep the long-term view. Keep the optimism that you need to succeed as an investor. So that is my pitch for being hands-off. But Rob, I know you're coming from a lifetime of being very hands-on with your portfolio. So I'm sure you're going to have some strong arguments to come back with.
Okay, so admittedly, I'm not very hands-on with my portfolio. However, I'm going to fight because I'm a fighter. And my fight is that it's not as hands-off as you think because you have to build that team. So you have to build a team in the first place. And you have to know that you can trust every member of your team, your letting agents, your mortgage brokers, etc. How do you know you've got a good one? If you do it yourself, then you know it's going to be done well. Also, if you are dealing with the challenges that come up, you know it's going to be dealt with properly and done well first time. If the person you're working with isn't very good, they could be storing up problems to just dump at you at a later date. Or worse still, they're not very good at dealing with them at all, and you end up being hands-on when you've attempted to be hands-off. So, Rob, I think you're making it out that it's easier than it is. I think hands-on has a place, and some people do hands-on, so it must work. Even if it doesn't work for me and you.
Well, I don't know if you convinced yourself there, but I do. You did convince me. That's not the strongest argument I've heard from you, but there is definitely some truth in there, which I think you could sum up as delegation versus abdication. If you step back and the person who's meant to be doing it does not do a good job, then yes, that leaves you in a worse position than you would have been. But of course, you could say that for anything. You have to assume the best version or at least a good version of any of the situations that we're talking about. And again, I think you admitted it yourself. Given that we've both been doing this for a long time and we've both decided to be hands-off, I've got to take the point on this one. Hands-off wins.
Okay, I'm worried. We're late into the fight. You are winning. Let's now get some points back. Let's do limited company versus personal name. So how do you purchase your properties? Do you buy it in a limited company or your own name? I'm going to go for the easy win. I'm going to go limited company. That is the way forward now. Since the tax changes, it's the most efficient way. You can't offset your interest as a cost in your own name. You can in limited company. I purchase all my properties in limited companies now. I'm going to be naughty and acknowledge that what I know you're going to come back with, that mortgages are a little bit more expensive with limited companies, but they are improving. More people are coming to the market. And even with that extra expense, in the majority of cases, you are still better off investing through a limited company. Do I get the win?
Ooh, this is a tricky one because for the majority of investors, I think that is all completely true. And I would struggle to defend personal name. But on a technicality, I think we have to give this a draw because nothing in the world of tax is cut and dried. Everyone's circumstances are different. There will be people based on the circumstances, based on their goals, based on one of 100 different factors that mean that buying in a personal name is the right thing to do. So in fact, Rob, I think it would be irresponsible to give you a win because it would give people the wrong idea that there is a cut and dried answer to this situation. So it has to be a draw.
Oh man, this is painful. All right, it's going down to the wire now. Last one for me to not go off in a sulk and at least get a draw. And I don't even like drawing, but at least get a draw. Property versus stocks. Rob, you could do one. I'm taking property. It's the property podcast. It's a draw. We're done.
Guys, try and make my argument.
Let's go on then.
Fine. Okay, stocks. So there are two obviously great things about investing in stocks rather than property. The first is we've talked about hands-on versus hands-off. Hands-off won that argument. Therefore, surely, just to be logically consistent, stocks has to win. Because with stocks, you don't have to do anything. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of people go off to work every morning to do their jobs on your behalf, and you get a little bit richer. Isn't that an amazing thing? And as if that weren't enough, there's the tax treatment. As property investors, we get taxed to death. If you're investing in the stock market, you can fill up your SIP, you can fill up your ISA, and either defer your tax or even pay no tax at all. So the more I think about this, Rob, the more I think we should rename this the Stock Market Podcast.
Okay, well, before we contact the marketing team and give them the shock of their life, let's just try and bring this back into balance and acknowledge that you can be hands-off with stocks and often are hands-off with stocks, but you still watch it. And with stocks, it's far more volatile, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with volatility. You could be up 5% next week and feeling very happy, but you could be down 7% the week after. It's always moving, and that movement can stress people out. Property, you don't get updates on how it's performing day to day, week to week, or even month to month. Yes, there's indices that we report on, but you don't really feel it. You just buy, you hold, and it just feels more comfortable. And as we've already acknowledged, you can be hands-off. Doesn't mean you get away with doing nothing. Of course, stocks is more hands-off, but you can be hands-off with property. But the real killer here, Rob, is, yes, some people, and they say this every time, you can use leverage with stocks, but the majority of people don't and shouldn't use leverage with stocks. It comes with risk because of that volatility that we talked with, quite a bit of risk. Property with debt outperforms the stock market. So you could argue that stocks outperform property if you look at long-term performance. And it will depend on the date ranges you pick, and you can adjust it so one wins over the other. But I think more people would argue that stocks outperform property. But that doesn't take into consideration leverage. And leverage is one of, if not the most powerful tool in your toolbox when it comes to property investment. It is the wealth creator, that you buy an asset that goes up faster than inflation, and that same inflation is eroding the debt that you own, and you're paid while you own it. Rob, that is why we have the property podcast. I actually think stocks are great. I also invest in stocks, but the reason why more of my wealth is tied up in property is for the reasons I've just outlined. We are the property podcast. Rob, I don't want to beg, but I think I should win this one.
I feel like it's the 95th minute. You've got a corner, your goalkeeper's come up into the box and he's just scored a towering header to bring it equal. The crowd's going wild in the last minute. Of course, property has to win that one. With leverage being the key point, I completely agree. So I think, Rob, we've avoided another bowling incident. Are you happy with the draw? 2-2?
Yeah, I am. And if we're being honest with ourselves and our audience, if we went through and were able to pick our own sides, we would have picked what had won on each side. And the draws truly are draws. It will depend on what you want to do and what you are trying to do as an investor. So flats versus houses, both are good. Capital growth versus yield, it'll depend on your strategy. Limited company versus personal name. Again, Rob, technically it is a draw because of the people's personal circumstances. We did not give any tax advice in this episode before you start making decisions on our battle. I think in property, most of these are draws, but there are a few wins which we've identified, and they are wins for a reason. And it's been hard to argue for the other sides when we've not been on the side of the win, because we both believe they are wins. But in that fun that we've had, there are a lot of lessons in that episode. So hopefully you as property investors can take those lessons, take on understanding that it isn't always clear cut, there isn't always a winner, but when there is, you should probably double down in that direction.
Okay, well, let's finish this episode with something we can both agree on, which is Hub Extra. It's always good to end the show with something that brings you a little bit more, that improves your life in some way. And this week, I'm bringing along some headphones. But no, not just any headphones, the best headphones, as tested by me, someone who's been through a whole lot of pain and a whole lot of experimentation, trying to find something that works. And especially headphones with a good microphone for calls. Because as you know, the two of us do a weekly call where we're both separately going for a walk, but on the phone. And I like to do as many of my calls as possible on the move. And when I'm not on the move, I'm often in noisy environments like co-working spaces. I used to use AirPods, but they just don't cut it for this purpose. The microphone is not good enough. So I've tested loads of others, and the winner, the clear winner, is the Jabra Evolve 265. Don't know why all headphones have got really impossible to remember names, but this is the Jabra Evolve 265. These are not the most recent. There are more recent, more expensive models in this range that supposedly have more advanced noise cancellation, but they're not as good, in my opinion. These ones have got absolutely fantastic microphone quality. So I've done calls where I've been basically walking down the side of a motorway and no one would know that I wasn't in my own private office. They do look quite silly. I will concede that they look quite silly, but they are amazing. So if you're in the market for headphones that specifically have really great microphone quality, I've tested them all. These are the best.
They are the best, Rob, because we do our weekly calls on a Friday together and we both walk on that call. And you have had different headphones. And often I felt like I've been walking alongside you because of the noise. Like the traffic going by is horrendous. And I don't actually know if you're outside now. I ask the question often, are you on the walk today? That's how good the noise cancellation is. So I can endorse it as well as somebody on the receiving end that these headphones are very, very good. So we'll link to them in the show notes. Check them out if you are after repair. I'm sure you could use them in the office as well if you're in a busy environment. Probably work just as well, if not better, for that situation too. So we'll link to it in the show notes. Check them out. If you need some headphones, Rob's found the best ones.
Well, that is us done for this week. Just before we finish up, a quick shout out to listener Gary. And Gary's doing what a baffling number of people do, which is go back and start the podcast from the beginning. He said, I'm a tree planter and my job is incredibly physically demanding, so I don't know how long I'll be doing it for. My dream would be to slowly transition into property. I'm currently on episode 4 out of about 500, so lots to catch up on. I also follow you guys on YouTube. Great content. Well, Gary, thank you for listening. By the time you catch up and you hear this shout out, it'll be the year 2050, and I'm sure you'll have a monster portfolio by then. So well done. Congratulations on your future success. That's us done for this week. We'll see you back here next Thursday to do it all again. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.